All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and have a seat. We're going to open with a word of prayer, and we'll dismiss the children. Would you please pray with me? Oh, Father and God, we do praise you this morning. We thank you for another wonderful day, this Lord's Day on which we can gather and fellowship and worship you. We pray, oh God, that you would be with us by your Spirit, that you would give us attentive minds, and that you would turn our hearts towards you. Would you bless our teaching this morning with the adult Sunday school as well as the children's, and work faith in our hearts, faith in your promises and your word and in the Lord Jesus Christ, and prepare us also for the worship service. And we ask all of this in the name of your Son. Amen. The children are dismissed at this time.
Okay, so that's fine. No, whatever they decide, bring all that.
All right. Well, now that we lost half our class. We are continuing our series on American Presbyterian church history, and just a brief recap. Last time we looked at the events of the Old School, New School split of 1837 and 38. So we kind of got into the details. If I were to just highlight a couple things, you had the 1836 Assembly, General Assembly, which is where Albert Barnes, a New Schooler, he had been brought up on charges. This was the second time he was tried. And you had a New School majority at that assembly, and so they acquitted him. And there were some other things that happened, but that was the big event. So the Old School gained the majority in 1837, and they said, we've had enough after the controversy over several years, and we're going to split the church. And so what they did is they got rid of the old 1801 plan of union between the Presbyterian Church and the Congregationalists. So that's done. And then they went further, and they excised 4 New School synods and basically kicked him out of the church. Of course, there were questions and concerns, maybe some of them legitimate, about the constitutionality of that move, but that's what happened. The South sided with the Old School, and so that's really what gave the Old School sufficient numbers. They not only had Old Schoolers in the North, but they had the majority of the Southerners, and so that was the Old School, New School split. And that was led by George Baxter. He was the moderator, 1837. Baxter was professor and president of Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. And so Baxter really is this leader. He's an Old School leader, but he's a Southern leader as well. Okay, so what I wanted to discuss today a little bit, we'll do basically 2 topics. I want to summarize the causes of the Old School, New School split, because there's some debate here, and kind of give my take on things. And then second, is tied with this, is the New School is actually going to go on to split again in 1857, only 20 years later. It's not a full split, because, let me explain. The Old School, New School divide was pretty even in the Presbyterian Church, but similar size. When the New School splits, it's really in 1857, it's really the Southern churches leave, and that's only about 10% of the New School. And that has to do with abolitionism, their concern over the issue of slavery. So, and then there'll be realignment after the Civil War, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. We'll cover that hopefully next week. Okay, so many historians have held that that doctrinal issues between the Old School and New School really was the primary cause of the split. And when we think of doctrinal issues, there's several here. One of which would be different views of original sin. We've discussed some of this before. I don't want to rehash all of it. I'll just kind of mention. But there's division over the imputation of Adam's guilt to humanity. So the New School tended to, I don't think they all held this stuff, but some of them favored what was called mediate imputation, so that you're not guilty of Adam's sin until you actually commit sin. That's kind of what it was how that would play out. Many of the old schoolers held to immediate imputation, though not even, we wouldn't say all of them. Also, the imputation of Christ's righteousness, some New Scholars seem to have denied that. And then the extent of the atonement. So one of the interesting things is the New Scholars almost, I don't know if I could say universally, but it tended to be a very distinct view. The New Schools, they held that more of a, what would be called a general atonement, that Christ died for all men. And that actually does have some, there's always been some Reformed who have held that. Actually, you could argue is the majority view of the Reformers. But I don't want to get too into that right now. But just know there were some doctrinal divide between the two groups. Okay, so that's really the main issue. This is the charge. This is the primary issue, because you had Albert Barnes and so he was brought up on charges for some different things, and then he was acquitted. So there's the doctrinal divide, and the old schoolers, at least the ultra old schoolers, are charging that the new school, the Presbyterian Church is not sufficiently dealing with these problems, or sometimes they call them heresies. I mean, so there's pretty strong language being thrown around. Now we mentioned before, though, just to clarify, that there was the New Scholars, which I don't think were heretics, but there were some who held more radical views of the New England theology, which would be like Taylorism, where they actually denied original sin. So there was some heresy, but I don't think this was a major problem in the Presbyterian Church. But some of the ultra old scholars were saying it was. Okay, so many historians have held that the primary cause of the old school and new school split was doctrine. And I'll come back to say I do think that is primary. Other things I left out was debate over missions boards, particularly missions boards outside of the Presbyterian Church, so cooperative mission boards. And then even the issue of revivalism. We've mentioned Charles Finney and how at least some of the New Scholars were more sympathetic to him. He ends up leaving the Presbyterian Church in 1835 anyway, but so there's a lot of things going on. The other issue is going to be slavery, and particularly abolitionism, which, just to recap, abolitionism is the view that slavery is always wrong in and of itself, and therefore an illegitimate relationship. Now, I'm going to argue that slavery was also an issue, so we'll put abolitionism up here, because that's more particular. It's not just slavery, it's abolitionism, which is opposing all slavery. Now, some old schoolers, such as Samuel Baird, B-A-I-R-D, Samuel Baird said that slavery had nothing to do with the split. In fact, he claimed that the New School brought up slavery to stigmatize the majority, he said, by claiming that the Old School had a corrupt alliance with the South in the interest of slavery. So he's saying slavery had nothing to do with it. It's just a charge to make the Old Schoolers look like that was the issue. Of course, I think there's some problems with his denial, which I'll get into in a moment. One of those is well, we'll see some of the statements from the Southerners themselves. There have been some historians that have denied that the doctrinal issues were sufficient to cause a split, and that slavery was the decisive cause of the schism. So this is where some of this is kind of nuanced. So some are denying that abolitionism or slavery have anything to do with it. Some are saying abolitionism is almost primary in a sense. Here's my analysis, is that, without getting into all the details, but I can explain this a little bit. My analysis is the majority of historians are correct that doctrine was the initial cause of faction within the church and thus was the primary cause of split. So doctrine definitely was how things started, and I would say it was primary. Okay, I do think that's primary. However, I get my notes here. However, I would qualify this in two ways, which is first, the doctrinal dispute was not a sufficient cause for the split at the time. So if we're talking specifically 1837 and 38, we don't know when this doctrinal split would have happened. It's not even guaranteed it would have happened. And so I would say it this way, is that both doctrine and abolitionism were necessary conditions for the split to occur at the time it did, 1837 and 38. So you really have both of these coming together to lead to the split at the time that it happens. There's one scholar who put it this way, Victor Howard, I think he's right. He said, although doctrine was the cause of the division, it is difficult to see how it could have been accomplished without the entering wedge of slavery. So I think that's accurate. That's my take, is that it's primarily about doctrine, but abolitionism came in and really caused the split. So I think Samuel Baird is wrong when he denies that abolitionism played a role here. I don't think the question is whether doctrine and abolitionism were causes, but really the question is how they were causes. And this is where there could be some debate. I think here's one point. If the South had remained neutral in the dispute, and it might have, had abolitionism not been an issue, then it's possible that the South, along with the moderate Princeton Party, which I mentioned them before, could have maintained the peace between the two factions. So you had the old school, new school, you had the moderate Princeton Party, that's Charles Hodge, Archibald Alexander, Samuel Miller. They're trying to maintain the peace in the church. And then you have the South, which was neutral for a long time. So without abolitionism, I don't know if you necessarily get a split. Some guys have said, oh, well, if there's no abolitionism, 1837, the old school, they're not going to show up and they're just going to secede. They're going to leave the church. That's possible, but it's also, as a significant minority, I think that would be kind of crazy. They would have lost a lot of power and they wouldn't have been that big without the South. So I think the way I would explain it here is that, in a different way, is that abolitionism hastened the divide, so it quickened it, and it prevented any possibility of rapprochement between the two sides. So we don't know what would have happened without abolitionism, but abolitionism definitely caused the split to happen more quickly, at least in 1837. And then things got formalized in 1838, as I kind of mentioned last time. Let me give some words or some explanation from some of the Southern leaders. So we've discussed before George Baxter, who doesn't get a lot of attention, but he should. He was moderator of the 1837 Assembly, and he was, as I said, president of Union Seminary in Virginia. And then you have William Swan Plumer. So here, just to write these for big names up here. You got Baxter, and then you got Plumer. Plumer's more well known today because of some of his writings, particularly his commentaries on like the Psalms and the like. So Baxter, well, actually, let me mention a newspaper here because this will play in. So Plumer founded. He founded it's a newspaper called the Watchman of the South. Okay, so that's the newspaper he founds, and that's in August 1837. Oh, that's a few months after the old school, new school split. Well, there's a reason. There was another man who ends up going with the new school. His name is Amasa Converse. And he was the editor of what was called the Southern Religious Telegraph. The Southern Religious Telegraph tried to stay relatively neutral in the controversy But when the split happens, Converse, he's definitely against a split. He doesn't want to divide in the church. And Converse basically condemns the split because he says, this is what a lot of the New School Southerners said, is they said it's unconstitutional to kick out the four synods like they did. Okay, so in response to Amasa Converse's Southern Religious Telegraph, Plumer founds the Watchman of the South. And it ends up becoming extremely successful. And it eventually merges. Well, it's so successful that 4 other papers are sold to it. So that's wild. And then in 1845, it's actually Plumer resigns. It's not bad. It's just that it's renamed the Watchman and Observer, and Benjamin Gildersleeve becomes the editor. So that's a pretty big paper in the South at the time. So part of the reason I mention this is Plumer he was an ultra old schooler, and he's actually from the North, but he ends up very sympathetic with the South, and he founds this paper in Virginia because at the time he was pastoring in Virginia, and we have some important statements from particularly Baxter in the Watchman of the South. So Baxter says in 1837 that the New School had attempted a revolution, quote, at 2 points, an attempt to change our creed, so that's getting at the doctrine, attempt to change our creed, and to pour a flood of abolition into the bosom of the Presbyterian Church. So Baxter himself is, we've mentioned some of these things before, but you're hearing his specific wording on what's going on with the New School. I should also mention here, within a year of the Watchman's founding, so that's 1837, Amasa Converse moved his publication, which was the Southern Religious Telegraph. Within a year, he moves it to Philadelphia because it's just decrease in popularity. First, it's called the Telegraph and Observer, and then later the Christian Observer. And it was popular amongst the New School, including the New School in the South. But this is interesting. So Converse himself, here, I'll write his name up here just so you have it. He's not extremely well known, but he does get mentioned sometimes in the literature, especially because of his publications. So Converse, he later recalled a private conversation with Baxter. Okay, so this is Converse telling the story. He says that Baxter told him that he justified the exclusion of those 4 synods in 1837, the New School synods, on the basis that, quote, if we had not extended them, they would have extended us for slaveholding. So that's Baxter's words. Baxter said, here's why we're kicking them out, because if we don't do this, they're going to kick us out of the church. So they feared abolitionism. Now, you would think Converse is condemning Baxter. And actually, in 1837, he did disagree because Converse goes with the New School. However, Converse is telling this story in 1857, and this is after the death of George Baxter. Converse tells that story so that Baxter justifies it on the basis of, they get kicked out. And then what does Converse say after? He says, 1857, quote, were Dr. Baxter now living, we would confess to him that we greatly erred in our good opinion of the charity of abolitionism, and that he saw far more clearly than we its nature and tendencies, of which we then had but little conception. So this is funny because Converse goes with the New School, thinks that Baxter's in the wrong, and then he comes back 20 years later after Baxter's death, and he says, actually, Baxter was right. And the reason I say that is because in 1857, the Southern churches leave the New School. So they saw the problem of abolitionism and agreed with Baxter. William Plumer, founder of the Watchman of the South, he says something similar. He says that if the New School gained control of the following assembly, that would have been 1838, he said, quote, abolitionism will unquestionably be in the ascendant also, end quote. So Plumer himself agreed with Baxter. And remember, Plumer was an ultra old schooler, along with guys like R.J. Breckinridge, and there's some other guys in there as well. So Baxter and Plumer were on the same page, and they were both leaders in the South. Let me read a little more from Baxter. We actually have a quote from him. This is from the Charleston Observer in August of 1837. So we actually have a longer explanation from Baxter, George Baxter here. And this explains, I mean, when you think about it, what he did in 1837, it wasn't just him, but leading the old school, is it was a preemptive move. They said, we're going to, instead of us getting attacked and kicked out of the church, we're going to kick out the new school. Because they thought that abolitionism was heavily associated with the new school, though not unanimously. Okay, so here's his quote. He says, "Another advantage of the course pursued," so the split, "if it be sustained and carried out by the churches, is that it will put an end to the abolition question and disturbance in the Presbyterian Church. I always had the impression that the abolition spirit must be principally in the new school, and the good old Presbyterians with whom I had been acquainted could not be carried away with that fanatical system." Right? So that's how they thought of abolitionism, it's fanatical. So he thought that abolitionism was primarily with the new school, not entirely, but primarily, and he's correct. He says, "I found our northern friends reasonable and prudent on the subject of slavery, and we conversed about it in the style of former times before the fanaticism of abolitionism had infected the public." He goes on, "In the convention, there were 124 members, upward of 100 were members also of the assembly, and among these were but 2 abolitionists. These were from the Presbytery of Chillicothe, and they professed to be very moderate." So he's actually saying there actually were some abolitionists among the new school, and that was those from the Chillicothe Presbyterian. He goes on, "In the assembly, with the exception of those Chillicothe members, I do not believe that there was a single abolitionist among the Orthodox," he's referring to the old school, "whilst nearly the whole of the new school were of that description." So he's saying the vast majority of the new school were abolitionists. And he goes on, "From these facts and from others which I could mention, I have no doubt that if the acts of the General Assembly should be properly sustained and the separation begun should be carried out, the Presbyterian Church, by getting clear of the new school, will at the same time get clear of abolition." So that's Baxter's assessment. He says, we got rid of these guys because we didn't want them to get rid of us, which is abolitionism. Okay, so I'm going to kind of transition a little more here, I'll build off this, but any thoughts or questions here? I think when you read the analysis, when you read these comments from Baxter and Plumer, I don't know how you can say that abolitionism wasn't a factor in the split. It seems pretty clear to me. And part of this is maybe that a lot of historians aren't familiar with Baxter. I don't know how he was the moderator of the 1837 assembly. You'd think the guy would get a lot of attention, but he doesn't. So there's basically 2 causes, I think. Two kind of things, issues converging in 1837 causing the split. Any questions? Comments? Okay. So the 4 synods that had been excised, that had been kicked out of the Presbyterian Church in 1837. These were Western Reserve, Utica, Genesee, Geneva. They were mostly, well, they were all in the north, mostly northeast, New York area. They had, all 4 that had been kicked out had pronounced in favor of abolitionism and denounced slavery as a sin against God and man. So let that kind of be, let that set in, is that the synods they kicked out were all abolitionists, okay? Now, there were some other areas that were abolitionists that they didn't kick out, but that really is besides the point. These were all new school created, well, they were all new school synods, but they were created out of the plan of union, which was the whole basis of kicking them out of the church. Is they said, well, they're unconstitutional because the plan of union was unconstitutional. The problem with doing this is it's all so far removed that, it's questionable. So let's discuss the New School body, because this is interesting. So you have the New School Church formed in 1838 because that's when things kind of get formalized. And 1839, so shortly after the split, the New School Assembly acknowledged basically that there was difference of opinion amongst the New School Church on the issue of slavery. And so they left it to the lower judicatories, so the presbyteries basically, to deal with however they wanted. By 1846, the New School Assembly adopted a moderate anti-slavery position, but it wasn't abolitionist. They denounced slavery as an unrighteous and oppressive system, and they refrained from adopting the condemnation of slaveholders, which would be the abolitionist position. So here's 1846. This is the New School Church. They said, quote, "We cannot pronounce a judgment of general and promiscuous condemnation, implying that destitution of Christian principle and feeling which should exclude from the table of the Lord all who stand in the legal relations of master and slave, or justify us in withholding our ecclesiastical and Christian fellowship from them." So if you recall, you have abolitionism, but the big issue in the church is they're wanting to excommunicate slaveholders. So they're wanting to kick them out of the church and say they're not actually Christians. So the New School, even by 1846, is not abolitionist. They're opposed to slavery, but they're not abolitionists. However, in the 1850s, the New School Church starts to move towards abolitionism. There were actually some abolitionists who left the New School in the mid to late 1840s because they didn't think the church was sufficiently abolitionist. Yet in spite of that, the 1850 assembly stated that, the New School Assembly stated that holding slaves, quote, "except in those cases where it is unavoidable by laws of the state, the obligations of guardianship, or the demands of humanity, should be regarded and treated in the same manner as other offenses." The implication is they wanted discipline of slaveholders. Okay, even by 1850, they're we'll just say they're trending toward abolitionism.
Does it seem puzzling to you they didn't jump to that right after the South or the old school split away?
It's a good question of why. I just think they had the South in there, and I think they didn't want to initially condemn the Southern New Schoolers. So I think that's a big part of it. But over time, you just see the dominance of the abolitionists and just growing. Abolitionism was growing since 1830. I mean, it was pretty new in 1831, relatively new as a movement.
So, Zach?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it fair to say, while we have these two things that converge, maybe initially the split really was over doctrinal issues, and then the abolition thing was growing?
Yes, it was growing. So yes, absolutely.
That becomes more of a problem for the South with a larger proportion.
Right, but the old school church. What's interesting is after 1837, 38, the old school church, they don't really have an abolitionist problem. They have a lot of anti-slavery men, but they're not going to try to kick out the Southerners who have slaves. And by the way, that would include like old schoolers. That would include Charles Hodge and those kind of guys. They were not abolitionists. And in fact, you have a statement in 1845 that's essentially affirming like the spirituality of the church is that the church can, where the Bible speaks, they can speak to master-slave relations, but they can't tell the civil government to get rid of slavery because the Bible doesn't do so. So that's kind of the spirituality of the church there. So the old school assembly, but this is exactly what Baxter said, is he said if we get rid of the New School, we'll be fine. And he was right. But we're talking about the New School here, and they were already heavily abolitionist, and it just continues to grow and become a problem. So let me get into the details here a little bit more. So 1850, they're trending towards abolitionism. They then ask in 1832. They call on the presbyteries to report what they had done to eradicate slavery. So they're getting more aggressive. Hey, what have you guys done? And then the Southerners are getting irritated. Let me mention one of the New School leaders. This is Frederick A. Ross. And he's one of the New School leaders at the time, especially on this issue, the issue of slavery. He was a pastor, New School pastor, his years 1796 to 1883. He was a pastor in Kingsport, Tennessee, and then later Huntsville, Alabama. So those are kind of areas where the Southern New School are at. They're in Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, some in Virginia. They don't really have, I don't know if they had anything in the Carolinas. Not much. Ross was an editor of the Calvinistic magazine, and then that became the Presbyterian Witness. He writes a book in 1857 called Slavery Ordained of God. So he's obviously defending slavery. This consisted of speeches he made at the New School General Assembly in 1853 and 1856. So you can see this is getting debated in the New School Assembly in the 1850s. He also wrote letters responding to Albert Barnes, because Barnes was a New Schooler who had written a book, The Church and Slavery, and Barnes was an abolitionist. So you can kind of see Ross and Barnes are going at it within the New School. Then in 1855, you have a fraternal delegate from the Congregational Association of New York. They come to the New School Assembly, and they rebuke, this delegate rebukes the New School Assembly for its inaction on slavery, because even though these things had been debated, nothing had been done up to this point. However, that changes in 1857. So this is the big year, 1857, for the New School. The Synod of Western Reserve in the New School sent a memorial to the Assembly requesting that the Synod of Mississippi order one of its presbyteries, which is the Presbytery of Lexington South, to bring charges against a pastor named William Holly, because this pastor stated that he held slaves, quote, of choice and from principle. So he says, I don't hold them out of necessity. I have slaves because I want to. And, well, that didn't sit well with some of the abolitionists. So they're saying, the Synod of Western Reserve is saying, you need to bring charges against this guy. Well, Holly actually dies in the midst of this. But his fellow presbyters agreed with him in the South, many, and they asked the Assembly to transfer the charges to them. Say, well, you know what, go ahead and charge me with what you charged him. And so they asked the Assembly to direct the Synod to proceed against the presbytery. And so you have this conflict here between basically the North and the South within the New School. The 1857 Assembly condemned the position of the Presbytery of Lexington South for not disciplining officers and members for slaveholding, because it was slaveholding that was not out of necessity. And then this led to so 1857, just to clarify, the Assembly condemns basically the South here for voluntary slavery. And then this leads to a protest with 22 names, including Frederick Ross, that stated that this was, quote, the virtual extending of the South. So the Southerners are saying, you guys are now doing the same thing to us that the Old School did to the New School as a whole in 1837. The Assembly goes on to deny this. They say, no, that's not what we're doing. We're not trying to kick you out. But then they go on. I found this in the minutes. They appoint a committee, which includes Albert Barnes, to consider, quote, the means which may be safely and properly employed to remove slaveholding from our churches. So they're just getting more aggressive. And the Southerners are like, we're done. So the Southerners leave after this 1857 assembly. The Southern churches, they're done. and they form in 1858. The next year, in April, they form what's called the United Synod. So the United Synod, I think it's technically the United Synod of the United Synod of the I can't remember, Presbyterian Church of America, something like that. But it's generally called this, the United Synod of the South. Okay. So that's its name. Now I'll get into this next week. But the United Synod has a very short life as a denomination, because in 1864 they join with the 1861, the old school splits because of the Civil War, which then you have a northern old school, southern old school, and so it gets complicated. But then that southern old school absorbs the United Synod in 1864. So that forms what's called the Southern Presbyterian Church. And then you're going to have a northern reunion as well. But I'm going to get into those details next week. But I just point this out as the United Synod, it was only around for, I wrote the same year up here. Sorry, it's technically 1858. So it exists for 6 years. That's got to be one of the shortest lived denominations in history. I don't know. That would be curious to see. It's probably something shorter. So this is kind of interesting when you think about this. This is 1853. So this is prior to the split, the New School split. You had a New School publication called the Presbyterian Quarterly Review. So that's a New School publication. And remember, they're writing 1853, and they're looking back on the Old School, New School split. And they charged Baxter and Plumer with error regarding their assessment of the Old School, New School division. So I find this ironic because this is before the New School South leaves, 1853. They said, quote, "At the South, Dr. Baxter and Dr. Plumer could only sustain the Excision Acts by imputing universal Garrisonian abolitionism to our body. The South now sees that this was a gross misrepresentation." So they're saying it's false that universal abolitionism was the case for the New School. Now, Garrisonian, that's just abolitionism. That's getting at William Garrison. So they said the South now sees this was a gross misrepresentation. But there's some serious irony here. Well, first off, Baxter and Plumer never said that the New School was unanimously abolitionist, so that's actually not correct. However, this New School review is basically saying Plumer and Baxter were wrong for saying that the New School is so abolitionist. Well, 4 years later, the South leaves because they thought that it was filled with abolition. So there's just an irony here is that the New School wasn't even, I guess, they tend to deny what was even the case. So I guess one overall point here, and this is kind of tying the two things together, the Old School, New School split and the New School division, is that Baxter and Plumer were actually vindicated. I mean, I gave that quote from Amasa Converse, but it's simply the fact that Baxter and Plumer were, and Baxter maybe especially, was just analyzing things, I would say, entirely correct. I mean, regardless of what you think about abolitionism and slavery, Baxter knew exactly where it was going, and he considered it a threat to the Southern churches. And so he said, well, we're just going to split the church. We'll just get rid of the New School. And in the New School South made the mistake of thinking that abolitionism actually wasn't that big of a problem. Although the New School South, their main concern was over the constitutionality of what Baxter did, which is the extending of the four synods. They didn't like that. Dave, go ahead.
But saying that he foresaw that thing left, but by leaving, did he sort of ensure that? If they would have stayed, it's
Yeah.
PCA today, we see where this is going, we need to leave.
Right.
And so where's it going to go? The people that are left are going to take it where they wanted to go. Instead of the South, Baxter staying and fighting.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of the problem is that the doctrinal issue was already explosive, I think, and I can't say for sure that a split would have happened, but I would say it could have happened even apart from abolitionism. And so, I mean, you know, I gave that quote, I think it was last week, even by Archibald Alexander, where he said, I mean, this is kind of ironic because he was one of the Princeton peacemen, and he said, actually, a split might be good. I think these guys were just like that. Like, it was so divisive that they said, we just really shouldn't be in the same denomination. This is not peaceful. So I think that's maybe something that should factor in. I don't really care to evaluate whether this was right or wrong. I'm saying that there can be a time where a conflict is so great that the church, it might just interfere with the ministry of the church. And in some ways, maybe it was better off just to have the new school and the old school. Of course, the new school didn't last that long, but because they end up merging two in the north. Go ahead, Dave.
Like a lot of this issue is there's 3, 4, 5, 6 strong people that are pushing one way or the other.
Yeah.
In the church, and sort of like it's a tug of war. Who's got a bigger, who's got more strength to pull people along?
Yeah.
Because most of the people are sort of going wherever the churches are going to go, wherever their church is going to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's driven by these strong willed people who are just pushing the issues and making people think about the issues.
There's definitely leaders in all of these factions. Yeah, I guess, I don't know, the question as far as what would have happened had the South said, well, let's just continue to remain neutral. I think Baxter's fear was that abolitionism was even going to infect the old school, and that it would have just kept spreading. And so some of that's kind of uncertain, like as to what would have happened. But just to be clear, there were the abolitionists were aggressive, and I think that's the problem. Is they just took them as like, even if they don't kick us out of the church for holding slaves, they're so aggressive that all they're doing is causing us trouble and all these constant petitions, even to the assembly. And then so I mean they just didn't want to deal with it, basically. So
They just say nothing new under the sun.
yeah, I mean, yeah.
I'm following you with this diagram.
You've got the diagram. I'm going to give you a simple diagram next week. I'll draw this up there, but
One other feature in there, which, you know, this is sort of, when I look at this, sort of wheels within wheels spinning around, but there's something called the Free Presbyterian Church in 1847.
with abolitionists, yeah.
They kind of
Yeah.
goes through and they have little dash lines and it's.
And that's some of the new schoolers left and joined there. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, I don't think they were very big. But yeah, I mean, so the new school basically became, well, to be clear, the new school never became officially abolitionist. However, they were trending this way, and I would say I think you can say accurately they were de facto abolitionists. So maybe not in law, in writing, but in practice they were that way. In fact, there's some evidence of this. Is that in 1863, so this is in the middle of the Civil War, the Assembly referred to, quote, the sin of slavery, and then they just broadly, the sin of slavery, so that would be abolitionism. And then they described slavery, quote, as essentially hostile to the letter and spirit of the Christian religion, and then also, quote, the root and cause of this whole insurrectionary movement. So they're saying that slavery was the whole cause of the secession. I think that's a little overly simplistic, because the South wasn't going to lose slavery by staying in the Union, but it was more power with expansion out west. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so any other thoughts or questions there? I've got a little more to cover, but go ahead.
Did the new school up until 1857 pretty much stay together? Did they hold the planning union, they kept the Congregationalists in, or did they splinter pretty quickly?
So the new school ends up, after 1858, Well, they had already kind of broken some things off. I can't remember the specific year. I want to say it was 1855 that they ended fraternal relations with the Congregationalists. So the New School itself had actually been moving away from some of its ties with New England Congregationalism. And I'll make this point again, probably next week or in the coming weeks, is that the New School, interestingly enough, I think became more orthodox. They actually were moving away from some of their errors, but they also were getting more abolitionist. So some of the stuff gets complicated, frankly. But okay, but let me mention here. So this is a good segue. So the New School has the issue of abolitionism, but they also have the issue of theology that I've mentioned. And really, the issue what I can boil this theological concern, a doctrinal concern, down to, is doctrinal toleration. It's not always what the New School held as a whole. It's what they were willing to tolerate, sometimes even at the fringes. And this is what the ultra old schoolers were making a scene about. They were concerned about what was tolerated. So I think I said this before, but I do not think the New School can be equated with later theological liberalism. Some people like to make that claim. I don't think that's accurate. There might be some tenets there of it, but it's not as a whole. New Schoolism is not liberalism. In fact, when you think of things like abolitionism and even teetotalism, their entire opposition to alcohol, they actually have a fundamentalist streak to them. Okay, so it's again, they're kind of complicated. However, I can make this point. Unlike some northern New Schoolers, the southern New Schoolers were essentially conservative. And that's why they joined the old school here. So I'm not saying there was no theological issues, because there were, especially with a guy named A.A.H. Boyd. He's one of their leaders, along with Ross, Southern New Schoolers. They're generally conservative, the United Synod of the South, which makes it so that they can join the Southern Old School Church in 1864. Now, there's some who would challenge that. Some of the South Carolinians did not agree. Palmer, John B. Adger, and even Thornwell, who died in 1862, they all opposed this merger with the United Synod. But it happens anyway, and Dabney kind of wins there because he wanted the merger. But we'll cover that more next week. So the New School did something in 1837. So when this split happened, 1837, it's called the Auburn Affirmation. Now this gets confusing because I think there's like several things called the Auburn Declaration or whatever. So let's not confuse that. So this is the Auburn. Sorry, it's not the Auburn Affirmation. That's the later one. Auburn Declaration. See, I am myself confusing these. All right. I'm in the 19th century. I'm in the 19th century right now, not the 20th. Okay, we're not going to get ahead of ourselves. All right. 1837 Auburn Declaration, this is a declaration by the New School Church, right? Because the split happens, and then the synods are kicked out. It's formalized the next year, but they want a theological statement to show that the New School is orthodox. So that's the whole point of this. And this even includes an affirmation on original sin. So they affirm original sin. So they're denying the extremes, like things like Taylorism. And what's funny about this statement is in 1842, so you have the separate old school church. R.J. Breckinridge, Robert Jefferson Breckinridge, is I believe he must have been the moderator that year. And he's one of the ultra old school leaders, okay? Breckinridge. By the way, grandfather of B.B. Warfield. So it's pretty, the connections here are fascinating. So Breckinridge says in his 1842 speech before the Old School Assembly, let me read the quote for you, and he's referencing this Auburn Declaration. He says, quote, "But even in such a crisis, this extraordinary party," referring to the New School, "could not lay aside its moral characteristics. And after doing so much to destroy the church and corrupt its faith, they drew up and recorded a confession, not only at direct variance with their own published declarations, but more orthodox than many who dreaded and opposed them ever held." So Breckinridge is saying that their Auburn Declaration is actually completely orthodox. But his charge is, well, but it's at odds with their published declarations. In other words, he's saying that they have people within the New School who don't actually affirm the Auburn Declaration. I haven't looked into this enough to know whether he's correct or not. But that's his charge. Well, actually, let me mention, I do think Barnes here is at odds in one sense, because the Auburn Declaration is affirming original sin, whereas Albert Barnes published in, this is a few years later, 1848, his notes on the book of Romans. Barnes writes, quote, "To the fact that men sin in their own persons, sin themselves, as indeed, how can they sin in any other way?" In other words, he seems to be denying that we sinned in Adam, right? The guilt, that we would have the guilt of Adam's sin. So anyway, it does seem to be the case that at least some of the New Schoolers were not entirely in agreement with the Auburn Declaration. But at least on paper, the New School statement they come up with is completely orthodox. So that this is, again, this adds to the complications here. But this leads me to my conclusion, is that the problem the Old School had with the New School was not its formal doctrinal statements, but its toleration of doctrinal deviations. So Breckinridge doesn't have a problem with this. He has a problem with other things he's seen going on in the New School. One thing I'll give you one quote from the Auburn Declaration, because it said that it disapproved and condemned the list of errors condemned by the late General Assembly. So it's actually saying we agree with the Old School in the errors that they condemn. But it goes on, the Auburn Declaration, it affirmed its subscriptional practice in accordance with the 1729 Adopting Act. So this is going back, we studied this before. 1729 Adopting Act, affirming their practice to admit a candidate, quote, "to the exercise of the ministry within our bounds and to ministerial communion, if the synod or presbytery shall judge his scruples not essential or necessary in doctrine, worship, or government." So in other words, the Auburn Declaration is saying that we leave doctrinal exceptions. So if you differ with the standards, we leave that to the courts. We leave it to the presbyteries, which this is how the PCA even functions today. I mean, this is how Presbyterian churches have functioned. So the Old School differed over what was considered essential doctrine, right? So again, some of this just goes back to, I said this before when we covered subscription in the Adopting Act, 1729 Adopting Act, is the subscription problem has never been solved in the Presbyterian Church, because even if we leave things to the presbyteries, and at that point, the assembly can say that the presbyteries can't allow certain exceptions, but there's a lot of it's kind of comparable to like states' rights. There's a lot of power in the local level in the presbyteries. Now, back in the day, they had synods. Those could get appealed to the synod or to the assembly. Today, you could still appeal to the assembly. But so this was just a difference over what they were willing to tolerate. The New School was tolerating, though they have this orthodox statement, they're permitting certain scruples or exceptions that the Old Schoolers did not think should be allowed. So that's really kind of the issue there. Is not the Auburn Declaration wasn't really the problem. It's how it was being practiced, I guess is how we could say. And so you see kind of the same problem today. I mean, the PCA on paper subscribes to the Westminster Standards, but it's a question of what we allow. And actually, like I've kind of raised this before, we have substantial exceptions to the Sabbath doctrine, and so you kind of have this odd thing where officially the PCA is Sabbatarian, but in practice we have a strong minority that is not Sabbatarian, and that creates a problem, and I don't know exactly what you do about it. There's no obvious solution. So anyway, one good thing about studying American Presbyterian Church history is you realize that our problems aren't entirely new, and a lot of these subscriptional problems and doctrinal problems, though the doctrinal issues change, some of the structure and disagreements are kind of, there's a lot of parallels, I guess, from the past, even kind of the old school, new school issues. I would say in some ways our problems today are much worse, though, because nobody back then was questioning the Sabbath. Worship was probably much more uniform there. It's not that there were no disagreements. You had Psalms-only Presbyterians, not in the Presbyterian Church of the time, but they were much more traditional and conservative. But I think abolitionism kind of led to some more radical stuff too, including prohibition and things like that. It was kind of connected. All right. Any other thoughts or questions before we end there? Go ahead, Mike. Yes, but I mentioned this last week. The old school church called itself the Reforming Assembly, and the new school church, these were official titles. The new school was the Constitutional Assembly, which of course there's an irony there because I'm sure they used it because they thought that what the old school did was unconstitutional. But that just gets confusing, so we're going to stick with old school, new school. Charlie.
I was just wondering, so much controversy, some of it aggressive, some of the language, the quotes you've read aren't exactly temperate. So I'm wondering how much of these battles are carried out defending the honor of Christ versus just on a worldly level of tug of war?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, some of it's just the fact that we're all humans, and so, even if they're in the right, it might be expressed in sinful ways or motivated by sin. I mean, Breckenridge was just a fiery guy. I mean, he was, and he's said to have had an anger problem. And, this wasn't his only dispute in life, like we can put it that way. But, I mean, so I think they had legitimate disputes, but then the Princeton men said, hey, you ultras are, like, overly concerned about some of these things. You guys are going a little too far. So, yeah.
Well, I like Charlie's point is it's like once the opposition disappeared, once the old school is out of the picture, then the new school seems to have moderated out, as if they felt some level of, are we going out over a cliff?
It is odd that they became more orthodox in a sense, or at least, like you said, they drove out some of their worst theology. Other than abolition, they ironically also became more abolitionists. But I think part of that is because there weren't the Southerners around, so they just weren't near slavery. They could become more abolitionist with almost no consequences, other than the South left, and that was like only 10% of their churches. So some of this is just kind of pragmatic in how it works out, Dave.
So the diagram,
Which I'm going to draw next week.
that's right.
Not now.
It shows the new school and old school coming together in two places.
Mm-hmm. Because there's a northern and southern church.
Which is sort of interesting, forming a northern and southern church. You see
Yeah.
that separation, and they're coming together. And you've given
It's a realignment, really, is what it is. Yeah.
Sort of interesting.
Yeah, and then the southern and northern churches will not reunite until 1983, which forms the PCUSA, but you already had the conservatives leave in both sections before that.
So a whole
So,
other path that you have picked up with Presbyterianism in the West, which is
Yeah.
where the ARP came from. The whole
the ARP. We're not covering much of
that's a whole other
those.
parallel
Yeah.
path, which really comes together, and that's where the Northern Presbyterian Church was in. It didn't join until much later.
There was a merger between some of the Covenanters joined with the Northern Church. Yeah. So yes, a lot of the Scottish denominations were smaller in the U.S. So we focus on mainstream American Presbyterianism. Although even to this day, obviously, you have things like the ARP in South Carolina, or mostly in the Carolinas. Okay, last question here.
Did these doctrinal issues, were they festering for a while, or was this something that just kind of sprung up?
Well, abolitionism had been festering, well, it really became big in 1831.
One more so talking about
The other doctrinal issues?
yeah.
Well, they went back kind of to the Plan of Union, which, so some of this I covered before. The Plan of Union was between the Congregationalists and the Presbyterian Church, and so they were cooperating. And that was since 1801, but I would say the problems didn't really come up until maybe even the 1820s. So it didn't fester that long. They really, just things got ratcheted up in the 1830s. The 1830s for both issues were chaotic. So, but there's background to all of it that goes further back. So, okay, we should stop there for the sake of time. We'll pick back up next week with the Southern reunion, and then we'll eventually get to Northern reunion. So, lots of realignment, hopefully help make sense of all of the chaos. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for these things and your work in the church, your providence, seeing doctrinal disputes and conflict, even things that we experience in similar ways today. So we pray that you would help us to understand these things, and that you would help us even in approaching our current challenges in the church and in the PCA. And we ask for your wisdom and guidance, and help us to remain faithful and even treat these things in a godly manner. And we pray for the peace and purity of the Presbyterian Church even now. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.